Effect. We need to secure this crossroads by dawn.
Pacific Theater, late summer, 1945. The morning air inside the compound is still. Barbed wire hums faintly as the wind moves through it. Beyond the fence, the ground is bare, hard-packed earth, trampled by months of waiting. The women stand in loose lines. Japanese civilians. Teachers. Wives. Daughters. Prisoners now, under American guard. They expect food rations or instructions. Instead, small paper packets are placed into their hands. Lightweight, unfamiliar. No one speaks at first. The guards do not raise their voices. No warnings follow. Only a simple explanation, translated slowly, carefully. Seeds. Flower seeds. For women who have lived through bombings, displacement, and surrender, the gesture feels unreal. Suspicious. Almost cruel. Seeds require time. Water. Hope. Things war has erased. Some women stare at the packets without opening them. Others clutch them tightly, as if they might disappear. A few look toward the guards, searching for hidden intent. Another test, another humiliation. But the fence does not move. No punishment comes. Only silence. And the weight of a question none of them can answer yet. Why would an enemy give life to prisoners? The answer begins far beyond this camp, rooted in how the war reached this moment at all. The war that led them here. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, exhausted phase. For nearly 4 years, the conflict between Imperial Japan and the Allied powers had consumed islands, coastlines, and civilian populations across Asia and the Pacific. What began with rapid Japanese expansion in 1941 had turned into a grinding war of attrition, one marked by naval blockades, strategic bombing, and the slow collapse of Japan's outer defenses. Civilian life had not existed separately from the war. In Japanese-held territories, women were mobilized into factories, schools, hospitals, and administrative roles. As the Allied advance pushed closer, entire communities were uprooted. Some fled inland. Others were trapped. Many were captured. By 1944 and 1945, American forces had taken control of large swaths of the Pacific, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Leyte, and Okinawa. Each advance brought not only prisoners of war, but civilians, Japanese nationals living abroad, families attached to military units, teachers, nurses, and laborers who had nowhere else to go. Women made up a distinct and vulnerable group among these captives. Unlike uniformed soldiers, they were not trained for imprisonment. Many had endured bombardment, hunger, and the psychological shock of Japan's weakening position. Some had witnessed mass civilian deaths during island battles. Saipan and Okinawa, in particular, left deep scars, where fear of capture had driven thousands to desperate acts. American commanders were suddenly responsible for people who did not fit traditional POW categories. They were enemies, but also civilians, subjects of an empire that had not yet fully surrendered, and witnesses to a war whose outcome was becoming undeniable. Inside detention compounds, life was rigid but restrained. Barracks were separated by wire. Movement was controlled. Food was rationed. Medical care existed, though limited. Interpreters mediated nearly every interaction. Yet beneath the structure lay tension. Many Japanese women had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that capture meant abuse. that enemy soldiers were brutal and deceptive. These beliefs did not disappear when the fighting stopped. Every gesture from guards was watched closely. Every order was weighed for hidden meaning. The war outside the fences had reshaped the war inside the mind. And for American forces, a new challenge was emerging: how to manage not just prisoners, but the aftermath of a conflict that would not end cleanly with weapons alone. That challenge would shape decisions made inside places like this camp. Decisions that seemed small, almost insignificant, yet carried immense psychological weight. Those decisions did not come from compassion alone. They were rooted in doctrine, experience, and a shifting understanding of what victory truly required. How American policy reached the prisoner's hand. By 1945, the United States military had learned hard lessons about captivity, morale, and the long shadow war left behind. Early in the Pacific conflict, brutality had defined expectations on both sides. Reports of Japanese mistreatment of Allied prisoners were widespread and well documented. In response, American leadership made a deliberate effort, at least in policy, to distinguish itself from the enemy it fought. The Geneva Convention guided treatment of prisoners of war, but it did not fully account for the situation now unfolding. Japanese civilian women held in Allied custody existed in a legal gray zone. They were not combatants, yet they were nationals of a nation still at war. Until August 1945, and deeply shaped by imperial ideology. American psychological warfare units understood something critical. How prisoners were treated would shape how the war ended, and how peace would begin. By late 1944, U.S. Army planners were already thinking beyond victory. Reports from the Office of War Information and Military Intelligence warned that Japan's civilian population, especially women, had been conditioned to fear occupation. Starvation, violence, and cultural annihilation were expected. If that fear carried into the post-war period, resistance could continue long after surrender. Thus, detention camps were not merely holding facilities. They became controlled environments where perception mattered. Guards were trained to avoid unnecessary force. Orders emphasized restraint, predictability, and routine. Medical care was provided not only for health, but for credibility. And gradually, subtle measures appeared, small actions designed to counter deeply rooted beliefs. Books were allowed. Children were given basic schooling. Gardens were encouraged where space permitted. The logic was simple but calculated. Cultivation signaled stability. Stability suggested survival. Survival opened the door to trust. 4 Japanese women, whose cultural world had long associated flowers with season, renewal, and emotional expression, seeds carried a meaning American officers only partially understood, but intuitively respected. This was not sentimentality. It was strategic humanity. The United States was preparing to occupy a defeated nation of millions. Every prisoner interaction was a rehearsal for that future. Inside the camps, officers debated constantly. Some argued kindness would be mistaken for weakness. Others believed cruelty would guarantee resentment. The compromise lay in gestures that were quiet, optional, and non-coercive. Flower seeds met those conditions. They did not force compliance. They required patience. They offered no immediate reward. To accept them was a choice. To plant them was an act of faith. And it was within this carefully calculated environment, between doctrine and empathy, that the moment in the camp unfolded. To understand why the seeds carried such power, one must examine the experience from every side: human, cultural, psychological, and moral. What the seeds meant to those who held them. The human angle. For the women inside the camp, captivity was not defined only by fences or guards. It was defined by uncertainty. Many had been separated from husbands sent to the front, from children evacuated to the countryside, from parents lost during air raids. News arrived rarely and often incompletely. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Silence filled the gaps. The seed packets were small, but they disrupted that silence. Some women refused to touch them at first. In wartime Japan, gifts from an enemy were often suspected of carrying insult or deception. The idea that something so gentle could come from the same force that had firebombed cities felt impossible to reconcile. Others opened the packets slowly, pouring the contents into their palms. Tiny shapes, weightless, almost insignificant. Yet those seeds represented continuity, something that did not belong to the war. For months, time in the camp had been measured by roll calls and meals. Seeds introduced a different measure, waiting for growth. Days would have to pass. Care would be required. The future would need to exist for the effort to matter. The cultural angle. In Japanese tradition, flowers were never merely decoration. They marked seasons, life stages, and emotional states. Cherry blossoms symbolized impermanence. Chrysanthemums carried imperial meaning. Even wildflowers held associations with endurance and quiet beauty. To be given seeds rather than cut flowers was especially striking. Seeds implied responsibility. They demanded nurture, not consumption. They suggested survival beyond the present moment. For women raised in a culture where tending plants was often tied to home, ritual, and identity, the gesture reached deeply, whether welcomed or feared. The psychological angle. Trauma does not fade when fighting ends. It lingers in reflexes and suspicion, in the inability to imagine safety. Psychologists attached to military intelligence later noted that small, non-threatening choices were among the most effective ways to reduce defensive hostility in detainees. Seeds did not command obedience. They invited agency. Planting them meant choosing to believe that tomorrow would come. Not all women made that choice immediately. Some waited weeks. Some never planted at all. But the option itself altered the atmosphere. The camp was no longer only a place of containment. It became, in limited ways, a place where time could move forward again. And yet, the meaning of the seeds did not belong only to those who received them. To fully understand the moment, the perspective of those who ordered the gesture must also be examined. What the seeds meant to those who gave them. The command perspective. From the American side of the fence, the decision to distribute flower seeds was neither accidental nor impulsive. By mid-1945, U.S. military leadership was already planning for a long occupation of Japan. Intelligence assessments warned that while organized military resistance would likely end with surrender, psychological resistance could persist for years, especially if civilians viewed occupation forces as hostile conquerors. Officers overseeing detention camps were given latitude to experiment with morale-building measures, provided discipline and security were not compromised. The goal was not friendship, but normalization. Seeds were inexpensive, non-threatening, and impossible to weaponize. They were also temporary. If the war resumed, nothing of military value would be lost. The moral angle. Not all American personnel agreed with the approach. Many guards had fought through island campaigns marked by brutal combat and heavy casualties. They had seen comrades killed by an enemy that often refused surrender. For some, compassion felt undeserved. Yet official guidance was clear. The war's final phase would be judged not only by victory, but by conduct. This was a conscious departure from total war thinking. American commanders understood that Japan's defeat would be absolute, but its population would remain. How they were treated now would shape cooperation later. The seeds represented a moral boundary. They were not rewards. They did not erase suffering, but they acknowledged humanity without excusing past actions. The enemy image angle. For years, both sides had relied on dehumanization. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as brutal invaders. American propaganda depicted Japanese soldiers as fanatical and inhuman. The camp environment offered an opportunity to quietly undermine those images. No speeches were made, no statements issued, only seeds handed over without ceremony. For some women, This act conflicted sharply with what they had been taught. It forced a psychological recalibration, not toward affection, but toward complexity. The strategic angle. Strategists later noted that post-war stability depended on breaking cycles of fear. A population that felt humiliated would resist. A population that felt annihilated would despair. But a population allowed dignity might adapt. The seed distribution fit within that logic. It was not about flowers. It was about signaling an end to annihilation. That signal would be tested not in theory, but in practice when the women faced the decision of what to do next. The moment the war paused, if only briefly, the distribution happened without ceremony. No announcements echoed across the compound. No flags were raised. The guards moved methodically, as they did every morning. Paper packets were placed on tables. Interpreters repeated the same sentence, again and again, in careful Japanese. These are for planting. You may use them if you wish. No instruction followed. No deadline. No obligation. The women approached in small groups. Some kept their hands folded, refusing to step forward. Others accepted the packets quickly, as if afraid the offer might be withdrawn. There was no visible reaction from guards. For many prisoners, this absence of reaction was unsettling. In wartime experience, actions always carried consequences. Kindness was rarely unobserved and never free. Several women waited days before opening the packets. When they did, they examined the seeds closely, counting them, testing their texture, even smelling them, searching for anything unfamiliar. There was none, just seeds. Conversations spread quietly through the barracks. Speculation replaced certainty. Were they meant to mark loyalty? Were they a test of obedience? Were they meaningless? Some women remembered gardens from before the war, small household plots, schoolyards, temple grounds. Others had never planted anything in their lives. Yet all understood what growth represented. Time, a future beyond confinement. The soil inside the camp was poor, compacted by constant use. Tools were scarce. Water had to be carried carefully. Planting would not be easy. And still, a decision approached. Not issued by command. Not enforced by force. A decision made by individuals, alone with the memory of everything the war had taken. The turning point did not arrive with sound or spectacle. It arrived quietly, when the first seed touched the ground. When something began to grow, it began in corners, near the edge of a barack, where foot traffic was light, beside a drainage ditch that caught enough water to soften the earth, along the fence, where sunlight lingered longest in the afternoon. A few women knelt cautiously, using their hands to break the soil. No tools, no ceremony, only small, careful movements, as if drawing attention might undo the act itself. Seeds were pressed into the ground, covered lightly, left alone. Days passed. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, the surface changed. A thin green line appeared, so faint it could be mistaken for a weed. One woman noticed it first, then another. They said nothing at roll call. They did not alert the guards. They simply watched. For women accustomed to sudden destruction, the slowness of growth felt unfamiliar. Bombs arrived without warning. Hunger came quickly. Loss was immediate. But this required waiting. As the shoots strengthened, routines shifted almost imperceptibly. Water was saved for the plants. Footpaths were adjusted to avoid trampling new growth. Arguments softened in places where the flowers grew. The camp did not become peaceful. It remained a place of confinement. But something had changed. The women were no longer only enduring time. They were tending it. Guards noticed, eventually. They said nothing. There were no rewards, no penalties. The flowers grew anyway. For some women, planting became a ritual. For others, watching was enough. A few refused to participate at all, unwilling to trust anything offered by the enemy. But the existence of the flowers altered the psychological balance. The camp was no longer defined solely by loss. It now contained evidence of continuity. When blossoms finally appeared, small, imperfect, shaped by poor soil and limited care, they carried no national symbol. They were not Japanese. They were not American. They were simply alive. And in a war that had reduced cities to ash, that fact mattered. The impact of that quiet change would extend beyond the fence, shaping memories, behavior, and the meaning of captivity itself. What changed after the flowers took root? The change did not arrive all at once. There was no moment when the camp became something else. Instead, it softened. Daily routines remained. Roll call still happened. Guards still patrolled the fence. Rations were still measured carefully. Yet the presence of the flowers introduced a subtle shift in how the days were experienced. The women began to mark time differently, not by weeks of confinement, but by stages of growth. Leaves forming, stems strengthening, buds appearing. In interviews conducted years later, several former detainees recalled that tending the plants gave structure to days that had previously blurred together. It offered a reason to wake with intention rather than resignation. Psychological reports from Allied medical officers later reflected similar observations. Camps that allowed small acts of agency, gardening, education, routine tasks, showed lower rates of depression and withdrawal among civilian detainees, particularly women. The flowers also changed interactions within the camp. Disputes over scarce resources diminished in areas near the planted plots. Women who had rarely spoken to one another before the planting began sharing water, trading advice, and quietly cooperating. The plants required consistency. In caring for them, the women practiced cooperation without command. For American guards, the impact was unexpected. Many had arrived at the camp carrying their own assumptions about hostility, resentment, and possible unrest. The presence of the flowers did not erase tension, but it altered behavior. Guards reported fewer confrontations, fewer refusals, fewer incidents requiring intervention. There was no official report attributing this change to the seeds alone. Military records are cautious, measured, but patterns emerged across multiple detention sites where similar policies were tried. Small dignities produced stability. As surrender became official in August 1945, the meaning of the flowers shifted again. They were no longer symbols of uncertain survival. They became signs of transition. The war was ending. Occupation was beginning. And the women who had planted life in captivity would soon face another upheaval. Release, repatriation, or resettlement into a world profoundly changed. The flowers would not follow them, but the memory would. That memory would resurface in the months and years that followed, shaping how the experience of captivity was understood long after the camps themselves disappeared. What remained when the fences opened? When the camps began to close, there was no single ending. Some women were repatriated to a devastated Japan. Others were relocated from islands that had become American territory. A few remained abroad, unable or unwilling to return to what awaited them at home. Departures were quiet. Belongings were few. Instructions were brief. The flowers were left behind. They could not be carried on a transport ships. They had no place in processing paperwork. Yet many women remembered exactly where they had planted them, near the fence beside the barracks, in soil that had once seemed lifeless. Years later, when former detainees spoke about captivity, the seeds appeared again and again in testimony, not as a dramatic event, but as a moment of reversal. One former prisoner recalled that it was the first time since the war began that she had imagined herself growing old. Another described the planting as the moment she stopped expecting to die suddenly. Such recollections were not uniform, but they were consistent in one respect. The act was remembered as voluntary. No one had forced them to hope. From the American side, the episode faded quickly into routine history. There were no medals awarded, no official citations issued. The officers who authorized such measures moved on to other assignments: occupation administration, demobilization, civilian life. Yet internal post-war evaluations noted something quietly significant. Camps where detainees were treated predictably, where agency was allowed in small ways, experienced fewer disruptions during closure. Repatriation proceeded more smoothly. Resistance was minimal. The flower seeds were never listed as a policy innovation. They appeared only indirectly, in margins of reports discussing morale, compliance, and psychological recovery. But their effect endured in memory. For the women who had endured war, displacement, and defeat, the seeds became proof that the enemy they had been taught to fear was capable of restraint. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but restraint. And in the aftermath of total war, that distinction mattered. With time, the story of the seeds would come to represent something larger than the camp itself. A moment that asked what victory truly means when fighting stops. What the seeds still say. History often remembers war through numbers. Casualties counted, cities destroyed, territories gained and lost. But wars are also carried forward through moments, so small they rarely enter official records. The flower seeds given to Japanese women prisoners did not change the outcome of the Second World War. They did not erase the suffering inflicted across Asia and the Pacific. They did not resolve the moral weight of the conflict. What they did was interrupt it. For a brief moment, the logic of total war, where enemies are reduced to targets, was replaced by a different choice. One that acknowledged that the war would end, but the people who survived it would have to live on. The seeds asked no allegiance. They demanded no gratitude. They offered only the possibility of growth. In a conflict defined by speed and destruction, growth required patience. It required trust that tomorrow existed. For women whose lives have been shaped by surrender, loss, and uncertainty, planting a seed was an act of quiet defiance against despair. For the Americans who authorized it, the gesture reflected an understanding that victory, without humanity, creates only the conditions for future conflict. The occupation of Japan would succeed not because of force alone, but because restraint was exercised when it was no longer necessary to destroy. Long after the camps closed, long after the fences were dismantled, the meaning of the seeds remained. They were not symbols of kindness. They were symbols of choice. In war, choice is narrow until violence seems inevitable. In its aftermath, they widen again, slowly, uncertainly, like the first green shoot breaking through hard soil. That is how wars truly end. Not with silence, not with treaties, but when someone once labeled an enemy is allowed to imagine a future and is given the space to let it grow.